Hey everyone, so I know there's been a few complaints about the sound. Look, I apologise for that. It's because I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, but you can see the panelling's well on its way. It's just taking a lot of time, so rather than do 600 videos of me just drilling holes and everything, I'll try and keep that brief, and I'm going to try and break it up with a couple of explanations on things. One being the engine, which is almost ready for its dyno run, and I know that's been a question that a few people have been asking. And two, I'll talk about the electric aircon that I'm running in this thing. So part of the reason for that is so that I can do away with all the pipes running front to rear, but I'll run through all that stuff. One thing on this front bulkhead panel, if you are doing the paneling, you're looking at a 10mm rivet spacing from the top there, same from the bottom, and pretty much same from the insides there. I'd like to get my steering rack in and double check the hole for the steering shaft as it comes through the bulkhead there, but I don't actually have it. I'm still waiting on my second delivery, so I'm just going to have a bit of a guess there. The other thing is that this rear bulkhead panel, it says a few times in the instructions, and you're sort of tempted always to rivet this thing in place. The one thing is that they talk about doing the floor, flipping the chassis and doing the floor next, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually cut the engine side bulkhead panel. The reason being is I want to be able to get access to the rear side of that bulkhead to mark up the insulation, and also just to triple check that everything's aligned there in terms of the shifter cables and stuff that goes through the bulkhead. So as much as it's tempting to rivet this one in place, I'm actually going to leave it off for the moment, and I'm going to jump ahead and cut this panel before I flip the chassis, and then I should be able to get all of these panels installed relatively quickly, and then we can start getting into the fun stuff like mounting all of the suspension components, radiators, running all of that sort of stuff, getting the side pods in, and hopefully my motor won't be too far away so I can get that in here. One thing that I will cover in the motor section is that you're going to note there isn't a whole lot of room at the back here. So when someone says, oh, how come you haven't put in a horizontally opposed 16-cylinder engine, it's because there's not really room without cutting factory mounts or modifying the chassis heavily. So I'll run through all that sort of stuff, but it's one thing to keep in mind. There's enough to tackle on a car like this before you decide to go away from a tried and trusted type of engine like the LS or LT type option. Just looking at the front bulkhead panel, and what you need to do is you need to clearance around the top here and here so that you can get around this section here, this bar here, and this bar here. Now what I've done is I used the contour gauge just to get a profile of that area and that area. Then I sort of, you can see underneath this bit of tape, I've actually given a rough outline of what that looks like, and the same over here. But because I don't want to just have a really rough cutout, what I've done is I've actually used a 38mm hole saw to replicate the radius of the roll bar there, and then I've sort of drawn a line of best fit, and it just means that these cutouts are going to be relatively neat. You know, you don't want them to be like this jagged rubbish thing that runs around the roll bar in this case. Having it fit closely to that weld is obviously going to be very uneven and a bit rough. So what I've done instead is I've just approximated what's there, and it should mean that we're going to have quite a neat cutout around that roll bar and this support bar here. It'll follow a bit of a line of best fit there. You're probably going to need to put a little bit of mastic or something in there, but we should find if we trim this out fairly closely, we'll get a very close fit there. First test fit, and we can see that you've got to flex the panel into place to get it in there, and also until we get those cutouts in for the master cylinder and the brake cylinder and so forth, you're not going to get it sit flat, but we can see that it's going to follow that contour fairly neatly there. It's going to be symmetrical both sides, but we're also going to need to just relieve a bit more space out of it. So I'll just mark that up carefully with a pen where I think I can pull out a bit of material, and then I'll just incrementally approach it sitting flat there. Alright, so when you see the crossbar here in the floor coming across towards the side panel there, you can obviously imagine that a few of those rivet holes are really difficult to get to. What I've done is I've picked up this little doodad here from Erwin. It's about $60. They actually didn't have a 1/8 inch drill bit, so it sort of put a bit of a stop to things for a day or so whilst that comes in, but that'll just enable me to get into the corners there very neatly. There's a couple of situations where you can actually get into the corner just by removing panels. So if I zoom in on the back section there, that one there, which is adjacent to the rear bulkhead panel. Obviously you can't get in there at the moment, but you can just tap those ones or just like mark them with the center punch, and then once you remove the side panel you'll be able to get in there to drill them. So that one's not absolutely necessary to have this tool, but there's certainly a few that are just adjacent to chassis there that are going to be very tight, and you don't want your drill to be running up against, you know, the chassis on the just beside it when you're drilling out the hole, and then losing some of the paint there. Okay, so like I said, we're going to leave the paneling alone for a minute and talk about the engine that's going to be going in here. Now, first things first, there's a number of ways to spec an engine, and to a large extent it honestly comes down to the personal preference. So this isn't me suggesting that an LT5 or some other variant doesn't have its merit. In actual fact, my first thought was to go down the supercharged route. So obviously I'm a fan of the LSA. It produces good horsepower, and you can pick one up for sort of 15 grand in Australia. They sound reasonably good, and they make really good horsepower without crazy costs. You know, I'm certainly not opposed to it, and this is the way that I certainly thought I'd go. But you can see here with the supercharger that it actually comes directly out the front of the intake manifold, and even if you could rotate that on an Ultima, which you can't actually with the LSA easily, I'm not going to say can't, it's not potentially not impossible, it doesn't really match up with the way that it fits in the engine bay. Huge horsepower figures offer awesome top end rush, and the feeling of a proper car at a speed where traction stops being an issue is something pretty awesome. Similarly, I love the challenge of keeping a turbo on boost, you know, a low capacity turbo, or wring the most out of you know, a small capacity NA engine. There's also some other factors like drivability and sound. For me, my passion's always been around road racing, and I've been fortunate enough to do a bit of it. I love the era of fast cars where they offered the most analog of experiences. Nothing focuses your attention like a fast road drive, and I think that the intrinsic risk involved also means that you're doing it because you enjoy it and you love it, not because, you know, you're a cashed up wanker. So Group C generation cars in that sense probably epitomise that era of motorsport. And it's obvious that the car that represents that ideal in a road car, but certainly harnessed some newer tech, was the McLaren F1. And I don't mean to sound generic in that sense, because everyone loves the car, and there are others like, you know, F50s and a lot of other things. But a lightweight road racer that sounds that good is certainly a bucket list item. Now, that is the long way around to explaining why I wanted a power plant along those lines. I was also lucky enough to buy an E46 M3 about 8 years ago, and its naturally aspirated motor really sells the virtue of naturally aspirated ITB engine. Just, you know, how the induction sound and the throttle response can be so contributory just to a great driving experience. And these are the Gen V ITBs that'll be going onto my car. There'll obviously be one on each bank, but you can see they're pretty amazing. They're a work of art in the way that these linkages are machined and put together. You can see the throttle openings there. This will be amazing, and you'll hear them. It'll produce some better horsepower, but it'll also just sound amazing. Even if you snap the throttle at low RPM, you'll start hearing the sound of the air being sucked from directly above your head straight into the top of the motor. And that is part of the reason why I went this way. So the specification for me was a budget of about 20k, which blew out to more like 35 when we take into account 7 grand of ITBs and everything else. I wanted good horsepower. Ultimas have traction issues on semi-slicks at 100 mile an hour in sort of third gear. So that was enough in my mind as a road track dual duty car. Even if you do race or track it, more power needs some big balls, skill or danger allowance, and probably a bigger budget than I have. The HSV that I showed earlier, that thing weighs 2 ton and has 540 horsepower on paper, and it's a fairly rapid bit of gear. I think there's a video somewhere of Tiff Needle running down a GT3 Lamborghini Huracan or whatever that generation was back in the day. So they're pretty quick as it is. Beyond that, I wanted amazing throttle response, so ITBs and high compression are certainly the way to go with that. I really like the engineering explained videos, and Jason, who's a much better presenter than I ever could be, has a great video on the virtues of the new T50 motor in the Gordon Murray design car, the successor to the F1, which I'd recommend watching when he discusses engine capabilities and why that particular car's gone down that route. And the other thing is I also wanted something that was suitable for the Ultima platform. I mean, they are around an LS or LT motor to start with, and that's sort of a tried and true format that they've probably, just over generations sort of perfected and tested up to pretty ridiculous horsepower levels. On that last point, when you do modify or strengthen the chassis in one place, say you cut out these engine mounts and you welded something else in, you potentially or unknowingly transferring stress to another part of the chassis. In the simplest of analogies, if you were to reinforce or stiffen a diff mount, for example, in your car, you'll find all the shock absorption that was in that part of the mounting will be transferred directly to the chassis. So you won't have sort of the softening of all of those sharp lows that come through the suspension. The benefit being that you get better feel and direct response, but using, I don't know, let's say an E46 M3, for example, you'll be tearing the subframe out that it's attached to. So these are things that you can sort of come to appreciate when you've built a car or you've built a few cars, is that it's not something that you just consider in isolation. And that's part of the reason why going to a different power plant is something that's really not something that you can just, quickly rip out the welds here, slap in some new ones, put in whatever motor you want. That's even before we start considering stuff like heat management problems that you're going to run into almost certainly. If you've ever seen, say, a finite element analysis stress contour image, it works like an infrared heat map with high stress shown in red zones, and then it progresses down through green to blue zones with little stress. It's actually an iterative process to develop a good structure where you've minimized weight by eliminating material in high stress areas, and you use dimensional strength. I-beams work better in one direction than another to aid in accommodating the high stress areas. And whilst you add a factor of safety, the very best of them actually create failure points where if the structure is overstressed in the absolute worst case, outside of its design parameters, it kills something that's minor or almost sacrificial. You remember how everybody fitted upgraded clutches to early WRXs? The next thing you knew is that everyone was destroying second gear clusters, and that was actually the fuse in that system. So that's something that's along that idea or that thought stream. Anyhow, that's not to say that you can't modify the chassis or put another engine in like many people have, but if you do it properly, it's not as simple as welding in some mounts. You have to do it holistically and really consider what you're doing. Here's a few pictures of some other builds. I know one of them is Ray Hall's twin turbo V10. Happy for people to credit other pictures, and I don't know how copyright works when these are straight off Google Images, but hopefully nobody gets butthurt. Yes, that is a Barra in one of the cars, and yes, McLaren did fit the S70 to one early test mule, Ultima test mule, and Gordon Murray is using another one to test a 4-litre Cosworth for the T50. Anyway, factoring all of that in, I came to the conclusion that I need the 6-litre from the McLaren F1, but I bought an LS3 instead. Well, I sort of did. The block's an LS3. Now, I know overhead cam engines have some intrinsic pluses, like the ability for VVT. They're more suitable to revs because they don't have a noodle between the cam and the valve train, etc., etc. But they also carry quite a bit of weight up top, whereas things like the LS or LT are light and compact. The LT can trace its heritage back to 1955, and it seems that we've gotten around most of their foibles over the years, such as the deep skirt block, which is good for strength but shit house for oiling, and they now rev better than they have any right to. Please don't jump on me here saying that the LT has VVT either. It's a new sort of fairly unusual system, and it's not for the benefit of high performance, but rather the ability for it to make an engine operate well over a wide range. K-Tech in the UK, who seem to be quite into the LT platform, do away with the VVT and active fuel management, if that's any endorsement. Now, my spec is an LS3 block stroke to 6.8 litres or 416 cubic inches if you're from the 1930s, and it'll be running on 98 octane fuel, which is in Australia different to what you would see in the US, but think of it as just the better end of what you can get at a service station or servo or gas station, whatever you want to call it, if that's a more universal term. E85 is more maintenance, and it isn't widely available where I am, but it is easy horsepower and it helps with cooling, so I can respect the love for corn there. Anyhow, my engine has a 4-inch Callies crank and Carrillo pistons to bump compression to around 12.1 to help make the horsepower. It has Callies H-beam rods and performance bearings, which help with reliability. Higgins CNC machined rectangle port heads with packed dual valve springs, stainless valves, chromoly rods, ARP bolts and billet timing chain sets, which all helps with some extra revs. It runs hydraulic lifters because they're now up to the task and don't require the maintenance like a shim and bucket setup requires, for example. There's also a power bond crank pulley, which I've chosen in lieu of an ATI, because whilst I love ATI, they are a serviceable item, and that's something to consider when your front of your engine's hard up against the firewall. Serviceability on the Ultima is something certainly to think about. It's part of the reason why I've gone for an electric water pump, which is probably something I'll cover alongside the AC in another video, so this one doesn't get even longer than it already is. And then obviously I have the 58mm tapered bore downdraft throttle bodies that I showed a bit earlier. The oiling side is going to be handled by a milling high volume oil pump, an improved racing baffled sump, a cooler and an accu sump. 2.7 litres. Now, everyone with an Ultima is going to want to burn me like a 17th century witch here and state that dry sumps are life. I agree in part, but I'll actually do a separate video about why I haven't gone down that way based on cost and the purpose of my car. Wait until I do that video, and then you'll have the opportunity to kill me in the comments. I'm 100% happy to take on that advice too, so don't think that I'm professing to know everything, and then might be some aspects that I haven't considered. So if you can help me out, that's all benefit to me. Whatever the case though, hit me up with some properly substantiated info. I know Bill down the road, who used to race NASCAR and is actually the real father of Hans Mezger, said whatever and said whatever, but that's anecdotal evidence, and opinions like arseholes, and everyone has one. So try and keep it relevant in that sense. So I am close to having a video of my engine getting running on the dyno, and I'd hope to sort of have it in this video. But I'll post it up as soon as possible with the data and some discussion on the oiling system. I've built a few engines, but in this case it's done by a firm in Melbourne. Whilst I will have onboard diagnostics and data logging, having a motor built by someone else means you're not going to have a leg to stand on in regard to warranty or even help solving a problem. It's something that's completely reasonable given the stupid things that even smart people can do when they're running engines or tuning them. So it makes sense for me to spend $1,500 getting the engine running to verify it's making the horsepower I ordered, and also ensure that everything is square before I do the final tuning. Then if anything goes wrong and I have the analytics to back it up, I might get some love back. The dyno will be a good place to get a baseline for fueling AFRs and timing, so I can get there pretty quickly. Even though it's going to be running a cross plane manifold instead of my ITBs, it'll give a good idea before I start the tune. So yeah, look, all I can say is that I'm thankful that there's sort of so much engagement from everyone watching these videos. I expected approximately 6 people ever to watch these, and they'd only be guys who were building Ultimas. But it is awesome to see so many car enthusiasts. Like I said in my original video, I'm only doing this for a bit of fun and to keep a record, and hopefully help some other people who are working on their cars. If there is anything you hate, would like to see, or want to get info on, just make a comment and I'll try and get it in there. If the interest keeps growing, I'll also try to bring the videography and sound skills up a bit. So look, that's the idea. Drop some info down in the comments if there's anything else you guys want me to cover. If there's anything you see that I've built or 3D printed or you want some more information on, also just let me know. I'm happy to send step files to people if they want to print things themselves or anything like that. Anyhow, until next time, thanks very much.